Hello, everyone, and welcome back for the third time this week to the nonprofits. Delaware is now the 12th U.S. state to allow its citizens to choose to end their life with medical assistance. First proposed in 2015, House Bill 140, recently signed into law by Governor Matt Meyer, provides terminally ill citizens in Delaware the options to end their lives on their own terms. Critics of the bill, using what the article's author calls opposite day logic, lament that the new law provides, quote, no hope, no compassion, and no help, end quote, preferring instead that the terminally ill continue to suffer needlessly, regardless of their own wishes. The bill allows preclusions for morally opposed doctors to opt out of performing the procedure, and it also protects unsuspecting and non-consenting patients from having the procedure chosen for them. And most fittingly, I think, the law was named after Ron Silverio and Heather Block, two Delaware patients who suffered to the end of their lives while waiting for this bill to become law. This story is from The Friendly Atheist by Hemant Mehta on May 29th, 2025. So, Eli, I'm going to come back to me. How well informed are you on this, Eli? Well, I'm far from well informed on this, but I have lost friends who have chosen to end their own lives before, and not in a medically assisted way. And as hard as it is, to process sudden losses like that, they're almost always unexpected, I think, but just by the nature. There's also something I think I want to say like cosmically altruistic about allowing people to end their lives on their own terms. I think generally speaking, people should have the right to choose when and how their life ends, if that is what they want to do. And for all practical purposes, we do have that choice. I'm only aware of one conviction in the United States for an attempted suicide, and that was in Maryland in 2018. Now, even though that person was convicted, they were given a deferred sentence and probation instead of serving jail time. But I still think that that's kind of a disgusting thing to do. Because you have people who are either, suffering physically or, however it may be, that have decided that not being alive was a better option. And even I think there are plenty of cases in which that is a temporary feeling, in which people can come away from that feeling, and I think should be encouraged to seek that sort of treatment to help them feel better about wanting to live, rather than making ultimate, extremely definite choices like this. But this person in particular was dragged back into the world that they had chosen to leave and then punished for making that choice. And I think that violates autonomy. But that all being said, I've been talking for a while. So Kelley, do you have any ideas about why there is such opposition to things like this, like I mentioned in the intro? Why is it such a big deal to any person if a completely different person wants to end their own life?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, honestly. One of the things too, though, in the intro, you mentioned that it was to end their life on their own terms, and I don't know if the bill allows that. Actually, it does kind of allow you to make the decision, but it's not really on your own terms. There's a lot of things you have to go through to do it, and it has to be done under certain conditions. So, but let's drop that for now. I was thinking of back in the 1970s. I'm so fucking old. Back in the 1970s, there was a movie called I Will Fight No More Forever. And it was about the Nez Perce Indian War. And there's a scene where, the whole tribe is trying to get away from the U.S. military. It's based on a true story. And they're just marching across hundreds of miles. And there's an older woman, and she realizes she's slowing up her family. She's slowing everybody up. And she just walks off by herself out into the woods, away from everybody else. And you know why she's doing it, And you're looking at you watch the scene, and it's sad, but it's also like this noble sacrifice she's making, And that's not the way Christians think. That's not the way Muslims think. That's a sin to take your own life, because that's one more person that can't give glory to God, right? So I think that's really where this opposition comes from. It's religious. It's not anything else. It's really sad that people have to suffer. I mean, at my age, I've seen a lot of people suffer when they really didn't need to. Most of the polls show that everybody agrees with these kind of laws. Why? Because nobody wants to suffer, except the Catholics, of course. But, you know, I mean, that's a 71%. That's a huge amount of people, you know. I mean, that's... I don't think we've gotten that many people all together for one thing in a long time. You know, why is it always? There's always like 30% of the people in a poll that are on the wrong side. Like 1 in 3. There's like every poll, right? Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter what the poll is about. There's just always this 1/3 of what people who are always against it. I just never figured that one out. Anyway, that's about it. I'm hoping that we can see the end of these like archaic religious prejudices end. I mean, because that's what's holding people back and making people suffer, right?
Yeah. And the suffering, I think, is the primary issue here, because we're thinking of suffering as like and the people who are affected by these opportunities to end their life medically are thinking of physical suffering in life, in the real world, in their bodies. And the opposition, I think, is arguing that, well, no, you're going to suffer for eternity. You're not ending your suffering. You're not reducing harm. But AJ, I wanted to come to you now. I think we kind of would all be in agreement, but do you think that there's a strong argument here to be made that this does reduce harm?
I do think so. And I think it has like what Kelley just mentioned, that it seems like Christians are very much against it. And it made me think, you know what? The only people that I have talked to so far who agree with this are fellow atheists. One of them being, and she has spoken about this publicly, so I am pretty sure it's okay to talk about this, but Cindy Plaza, who's a fellow nonprofit, recently has begun the process. And it's a very lengthy process, but ultimately, I've never seen a Christian who has agreed with it. And I think the reason is that us as atheists, we embrace humanism, and humanism is all about the reduction of harm. I wanted to mention that right now there's currently more than 10 states that allow assisted death generally, and this work in similar ways around the world. There are requirements that someone has to meet in order to qualify for the assisted death process. And that's the case on what they're doing in Delaware. For example, patients are required to have first a mental health evaluation. Sometimes it's more than one. There is a waiting period between that and doctor appointments. Then they have to have physicians repeated diagnose for this specific thing. Then they also have to self-administer the medication. I know that in some places they also have to have, like I said, more than one doctor that actually gives them not just the diagnosis, but the mental health to say, hey, this is a terminal illness. This is going to cause you unbearable suffering. There's no reasonable treatment. We don't have any hope for you to recover. And so that's what they have to go through. And that's what people don't understand. They think it's just a super quick process and, that's it. And then your doctor is going to inject you with something and you're going to die. But it's not even like that. Like I said, you have to self-administer that. Otherwise, it's considered murder. They also have to make sure that the patient is mentally sound to make that decision. It's not quick. It's not easy. And in my opinion, yeah, I have to say that it is about reducing harm. And we continue to talk about this in the humanist community. And, if this includes reducing the suffering at the end of your life, because we do it throughout our entire lives. Why should it be different at the end of your life? It's a hard topic to talk about, but I think that the more we bring awareness to it, the more people will understand why we support it.
Yeah. And I think the word harm, of course, is kind of central to this. And when there's a lot of when the word harm comes up, especially in medical contexts, people really like to talk about the Hippocratic Oath, right? And how that applies. And I remember being told, like, the first line of the Hippocratic Oath is "first do no harm." And I thought that up until earlier this week, when I was like, is that true? And no, it isn't. And that's where I think a lot of confusion comes in for people about, like, what does the Hippocratic Oath mean, and what does it not mean, and what is it really? And I think it probably does have, just as much of a factor in the opposition to this, as some of, like, the religious beliefs that we've talked about. There was language in the original, like, oath in the original Greek that says, I have it written down here. I will use diets for the benefit of the sick according to my ability and judgment. I will keep them from harm and injustice. And so that is included in the original version, but most medical schools anymore, they're using versions of it that don't include that. There's not a standard, universal version. It's more ceremonial and, optical rather than actually ethically or morally
rather
binding.
than meaning anything. Yeah,
exactly. And many physicians choose to just forego the oath altogether, as I understand it. So now there's language as well, and it's because of the specific language that the original oath has regarding euthanasia, because it does discuss that in some small part. But now, Kelley, you mentioned earlier that there was 71% of people polled were in favor of physicians assisting with end of life via painless means. And what I really enjoyed about this study that was cited in this article is that the researchers were like, well, because there is some phenomenon to be accounted for here, that, like, if you say things like end of life with painless means versus assisted suicide, that's going to change the way that the recipient interprets the question, and that might change their answer. So they did it both ways. And they said, how do you feel about doctors being allowed to assist a patient with suicide? And the number only dropped by like 7%, from 71 to 66, which means that even when you use a word like suicide that invokes so much negativity and repulse, there's still 2/3 of those polled that are in support of medically assisted dying. So
people don't want to suffer.
Exactly. But now, with that being the case, we seem to have a majority without a consensus. How do you think that's the case, Kelley? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Archaic laws. Sure. Archaic laws. I mean, let's face it. Laws get a lot of. I'm going to admit it right now. Some of our laws are based on Christian idealism, and this is one of them. To make suicide illegal, there's no reason for it, especially for a terminally ill patient who is suffering. There is absolutely no harm being done to anyone. Anyone. You are you are ending the suffering of the patient. You are ending the suffering of those closest to him. This is the way that things should be able to be done. But our forefathers, in their infinite ignorance, decided to follow Christian morality on this and created these really archaic laws. And once you put a law in the books, it's really hard to get it back off. I mean, look how hard it was to get rid of the buggery laws that were so prevalent in every state. And some of them are still on the books. I think Texas's is, if I'm not mistaken. It can't be upheld. The Supreme Court has knocked them down, but the laws are still there. And that's what's going on with this one, except that we're still enforcing this one.
Yeah, it seems to come from, like, just this sort of it's a sense of, I guess, ethical. It's this idea of there being things that are objectively good or bad, and ending a life falls under objectively bad in those worldviews. Now, and I think too that it's really important. We have a little bit, but it's important to distinguish between, like, the fail safes, I guess, or the safeguards that you mentioned earlier, AJ, that like this isn't intended for somebody to like call up their doctor and say, hey, I'd like to die on Tuesday. Do you have an opening? It doesn't happen like that. And I think that's really, really important.
That's why I mentioned, I don't know if it's on your own terms, because there's all these things, all these hoops you got to jump through, right? You know,
and that's why I mentioned earlier too, because there are plenty of circumstances in which a person might feel that this is the best option or the only option for them, in which truly they have other options available that can not only end what they view as what is, I shouldn't say what they view, because their suffering is their suffering as they label it. Not only end their suffering, but enjoy life beyond, like after the suffering, and that it may not always be necessary to end the life to end the suffering, and that's a really important distinction to make. But it does ultimately, I think, come down to autonomy, and we haven't really we haven't gotten really in depth about autonomy in this discussion. I think that's kind of a central focus of the law. I think that with like recent sort of changes in like autonomy and like medical autonomy, especially for women or people who are capable of getting pregnant, I should say, it seems like this is a little bit of a shift, I think, in that sort of autonomy war or autonomy atmosphere. AJ, did you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do, and I have to agree. It has a lot to do with autonomy. I think that, like, from this specific story, the takeaway is that we always discuss topics of bodily autonomy when it comes to, like you said, abortion or trans people, and a lot of people who identify as women undergo like really expensive and extensive surgeries to affirm their gender. Do things like slow down their aging, surgeries like breast augmentations, implants, go with tummy tucks, liposuction, get nose jobs, they get neck lifts, whatever, peeling of the outer layer of the skin. Like, I know someone who actually had that done recently. It was like they look like a completely different person. So we do the same for trans people, right? We advocate for them to have the same kind of dignity, to be able to choose what kind of body modifications they do, and justifiably they should have that right. And as I mentioned earlier, including abortion as a bodily autonomy issue, things like my body, my choice as a woman, like, we don't want to be forced to sustain another life against our will. That would be like against the law to do that. If the sustained life was that of an adult, or like even a child, not an unborn, right? Like, because it's a human right, and so we have to give that same dignity to people at the end of their lives, the liberty to choose. So if they and when we talk about end of life, I'm not talking about somebody who is older, because if it is somebody who's younger and has a terminal illness, then you can call that the end of their lives, right? If they have something that is untreatable, that they cannot, the doctors don't see any way for them to recover. So to be able to end their life with the same considerations regarding the freedoms of like what they get to do with their bodies, even if that means choosing to permanently cease to exist, they should have that ability to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. You said something that made me really think about it. It was about like when it comes to abortion laws or things like that, and we talk about how like you cannot force somebody to use their body to sustain a life against their will, and I think that should also apply to their own life.
It should.
And I can't stress enough. I don't always think that end of life is the best option in all circumstances, but there are people. Everybody has the right to choose that for their own. I don't think it should be punishable or shamed.
Let me ask you a question. We're talking about using an end of life option to end suffering, right?
Sure.
Medical suffering, and I think all three of us are thinking of a physical medical problem. What about a psychological one?
And I've kept that in the back of my mind the whole time, and that's why that is what gives me slight pause about this, and that's why I'm glad, like I mentioned earlier, the safeguards are in place, and I want to know what
That's
you
why
guys
they're
think about
there.
this too. Exactly, because I think. I'm speculating because I'm not an expert, but that being said, I feel, a license to speculate wildly. I think probably like 9 out of 10 times when you're talking about psychological suffering, you're talking about someone who there are some options for at least helping that person feel better or live a more satisfying life. And it doesn't require, like I mentioned earlier, the end of life to end the suffering, I think. So that's why
I just
you go ahead.
I
Yeah, I want to know
I
your
was
guys'
just gonna
thoughts.
say I just thought it was an interesting aspect to look at it, because
Yeah.
there are people. I myself have known somebody who is actually I've known two people that had just suffered with severe bouts of depression their entire life, and it was and a lot of different things didn't help them. They went years and years and years and years and years. One of them I know did eventually find something that worked for them and has advocated for it through his own nonprofit. Been on CNN, and I think that's freaking awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it just makes me wonder that if you get somebody, somebody who is just has spent 30 decades suffering from something like depression, is it viable to let them use this as an option as well?
Yeah, and I do think it is. And I remember when Cindy spoke to Ethan Michaels on his show about this topic, and somebody asked that question, and she did mention that the process is very thorough about that, because they have to show that they have tried so many different methods and that none of those methods that are currently available have worked. So it has to be all types of different medications, different therapies. So there, it isn't just like, hey, I'm feeling depressed today, like you said earlier, and you call your doctor and you tell them you wanna end your life next week or something like that. It can sometimes it can take more than just a few months. So it can take like up to a year or more than that. So it really depends on case by case. And what I'm thinking is we are thinking of the people that actually go through with it, but we are not thinking of the ones that are denied because they do not qualify ultimately, that they do apply, but do not qualify because, like we're saying, okay, no, you haven't tried this, or you haven't tried that, or, your diagnosis, while bleak, is not completely, untreatable
Yeah.
or terminal. So
Or like there's new research being done that could result in a new treatment. So let's wait and see. And then that person ends their life suffering, waiting for either a treatment or the option to end their life. And they just have to suffer the whole time. And yeah, there's so much nuance to it. I really think.
Yeah, it's not an easy. It's a very complicated topic for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was one that merits and deserves a lot of care and attention. But I did learn that there is legislation in the works in my home state in Missouri for patients that might be in the same position. So hopefully good news soon for those patients in a few more states here in the country. Now, all that being said, don't forget to check out the nonprofits store at tiny.cc/merch ACA. And if you want to see more nonprofits, you can click on one of the links below.